Okay, it's time to do the Diablo 4 in-game class tier list. We're going to go over every class, we're going to put them on the list, and we're going to explain our reasoning. Now, I have played all the way through the in-game, so this is going to be my best impression so far of what I've seen. We're going to be starting with the Rogue today. Now, I do believe the Rogue is an S tier in a starting class, but today we're talking about in-game. So we're talking levels like 70, 80, 90, 100, like pushing towards in-game, Nightmare Sigils, fighting the bosses, World Tier 4, the very end of the game is effectively what we're looking at here. So while it would be S tier if we're talking about the starting, I do believe the Rogue slightly falls off. Once you start to get to level 100, you start pushing to the end. They're a little bit squishier on the high end. The damage is going to be a little bit less than some of the other classes that we're going to talk about in this game. However, they are still a very solid option. This is obviously not a bad class. It is arguable. It is the best class in all of Diablo 4 because of how fast you can accelerate from the beginning. A lot of the legendaries are very easy to get, like in some of the first acts, Act 2, Act 4, I think, is when you're going to have more or less all of the major legendary aspects that you need. Rogue has a lot of variety in terms of gameplay style, though some are definitely better than others. So in my opinion, Rogue is not only a fun class, it's not only good early, but going into the late game, it is still doable. It is an A tier, solid class going into in-game. So if you're thinking about playing Rogue currently, but as you watch this list progress, if it's making you shift your opinion, I would just say stick to Rogue. I actually don't think Rogue is going to be a bad decision at all in terms of when you're actually playing this game. So personally, I would vouch for Rogue, and I know Veldshot and other content creators I know they're playing Rogue would probably vouch for Rogue as well. With that being said, we're going to move on to the next class. This, in my mind, is going to be the Necromancer. I'm putting at B tier today. I have not been impressed with the Necromancer in damage output. I've not been impressed in survivability in terms of things like the minions, although I will say it is better now than it used to be. I do think that Blood Mist could have been nerfed a little bit more, and in PvP, the Necromancer might actually end up being quite good, but PvP is not the huge portion of the game. And there is actually some support rows for the Necromancer. Shout out to Echo Hack. I was playing with Echo Hack at one point during the early access, and he was able to group them all up with some of the Necromancer abilities, and then I was able to nuke them down sort of as a druid. So I do actually think Necromancer has its place, but it's a little bit more of a support row, and I think solo would be a little bit more brutal. And so for me, the Necromancer is going to have a hard time being up to the potential of some of these other classes. I put it at B because I don't think it's a bad class. I think it's in the middle. But when we're talking about in-game here, ultra in-game, I'm not really sure the Necromancer is going to keep up with the other classes. I could be wrong. I just haven't seen it yet as the game is going. If you're going to play the Necromancer thematically is very enjoyable and does have maybe arguably the second, maybe third most variety in terms of build potential. You have like the minions, you've got like the Blood Mist, you've got the Bone Spear. There's a lot of different variant for the Necromancer, and the people I know that have played Necromancer seem to have enjoyed it a lot. So it is an enjoyable class, but in terms of in-game performance, I think I'm going to put Necromancer at a B today. Now, when we go towards the Druid, for me, the Druid is going to be S tier. My reasoning behind this is not only am I heavily biased because I'm a druid and I think the world sets around them. We're talking about early game, I'm going to drag it all the way down here to the bottom, okay? But we're talking in-game today. The reason is most of the legendary aspects, in fact, almost all of them, have some kind of synergy together. It also has the most variety in terms of build. So when you get to in-game, the amount of fun you're going to have by able to play different classes, in my opinion, is quite high with the druid. You also have insane survivability, which also ramps your damage. Okay, the damage from the Druid is quite crazy at the end game, as well as the survivability gets quite crazy. The other part about the Druid is you get a significant amount of CC. So not only are you good in parties, but also when you're pushing things like Nightmare Sigils later in the game and you're needing to constantly CC down enemies so you don't get one shot, the Druid here are going to help a lot in the Nightmare dungeons, okay, significantly. Also, if you're playing as a dual partner, then you can revive somebody in things like the boss fights, whereas otherwise, if you're playing solo, you can die. So having a druid that's very tanky can also be your reviver if you're really trying to push through the boss fights or something and you're playing non-hardcore. I personally think druid is actually definitely being slept on. I think it's going to be a more popular class than people realize. I think it's going to be a stronger class than people realize. And I think it's going to be a more fun class than people realize. I'm a giant shield for the Druid. I'm going to be putting a lot of Druid content out there. I think it's going to be very, very, very good. and we're going to move on to the next class today. Speaking of very, very good classes, I think the Barbarian is an S tier as well, primarily because if you look at things, you can even see this now in the build planner, there's 4 weapons. You see, I have 4 weapons here that you can apply to your build. The reason for this is because they have something called the Arsenal system. The Arsenal system is going to allow you to have more weapons than any other class. The reason this is important is because legendary aspects go on gloves, rings, amulets, and weapons for the offensive aspects. The offensive aspects are typically what gain you modifiers for damage. So having the potential of having more total modifiers, and yes, those legendary aspects will work even when you're not using that type of weapon because you have 4 of them and you swap between them. Even when you're not using them, you're still getting the legendary aspect modifier. That's why we saw people like, I think his name was Al Kaiser Senpai, that was doing like 300,000 damage during the level 25 beta with Barbarian, which was absolutely insane. He had all these modifiers. Whirlwind Barbarian seems to be, well, like it's going to be one of the best builds in the game. Now let's talk about Sorcerer. If you're playing hardcore, Sorcerer for me is S tier. The reason if you're playing hardcore it's S tier is because it has the only built-in cheat death mechanic out of any class, which is the enchantment on Flame Shield, which allows you to basically, if you take fatal damage, for that to be a cheat death effect. You become immune, you have a few seconds to get away, etc. Now, I'm going to drop it to A tier for anyone who's not playing hardcore, because I think at the end game, Barb and Druid are better. This isn't like Rogue and Sorcerer are bad. It's just Druid and Barb are at another level of insanity, and Rogue and Sorcerer seem to be at another level above Necromancer. All of these are viable classes. All of them I've seen push content. All of them seem to be perfectly fine if that's what you want to play. But Sorcerer in particular, I think if you're hardcore, is arguably the best class in the entire game. So I would put it up here. If you're softcore, it's much more like a Rogue. Very good start, very strong, decent variety, very fun, thematically enjoyable. However, it's going to be at the higher levels. I think it's going to be maybe not as good as Barb and Druid, because Druid for the survivability and CC reasons we mentioned, Barbarian because of the insane modifier reasons we mentioned, and then Sorcerer is just going to be quite good at the end game because it just has good damage and good stats, etc. Whereas these other classes kind of have something unique going about them, if that makes sense. So the Rogue and Sorcerer are really sort of competing for each other at just a DPS type of class in the end game, and then you got Druid and Rogue offering something in addition. Necromancer actually feels to me almost like the most supportive row out of all of them, except maybe the Druid. So that's currently how I see it. I could be wrong on this list. I'm sure there are people that would debate me I'm wrong, and I'm not trying to say I'm the god or the arbiter of knowledge and truth in this day and age. This has just been my experience so far of playing the game. Now, I do have lots and lots of in-game Druid footage. I will be putting that up within 24 hours on this channel. If you are interested in that, hit subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified when that comes out. As the Druid footage, trust me, you're going to want to see it. It's actually, I won't say it's a giant meme, but I'm going to say that in my personal opinion, the only thing keeping Barbarian in the race for like the best class in game right next to Druid is the fact that it has 4 weapons and 4 modifiers. Druid for me is the king of in-game. That's my opinion. But like I say, I'm a giant shill for the Druid. I have a lot of hair. I like my hairy boy. I'm a fan.